Chapter 23. The professor's clock struck 9 and the old man rose unsteadily to his feet.
"We had better go," he said. "Slip these about your shoulders."
He indicated 2 mud-brown cloaks draped across a side table.
"They should help you merge into the crowd."
OMalley raised himself to his feet and swayed over to the table. "Very pleasing," he said, casting the cloak about his broad shoulders. "Very ecclesiastical." Pooley climbed down from his chair and donned his cloak. "You would make a fine monk, Jim Pooley," said OMalley, chuckling irreverently. With that, the 2 caped crusaders helped the professor to extinguish the candles and followed the old man through the darkened house to the front door. Professor Slocum eased it open a crack, and the 3 men stared out into the mysterious night. All across the Butts estate, grim-faced crowds were moving. They moved with a strange, stiff-legged gait, like tailors' dummies removed from their shop windows and grotesquely animated. The eyes of these dummies seemed glazed and sightless, yet stared ever ahead in the direction of the mission. Professor Slocum turned up the astrakhan collar of his elderly coat. "Come," he whispered. He ushered Pooley and OMalley out through the front door, which he locked with a heavy iron key. Whilst he was thus engaged, his 2 inebriated colleagues exchanged knowing glances, furtively stooped and swept up 2 likely-looking house bricks, which each secreted within the folds of his robes. Lovingly patting their respective bulges, they followed the old professor down the short path and out onto the Butts estate. The 3 men slipped in amongst the sombre crowds, doing their best to adopt a stiff-legged gait and lacklustre stare. Pooley's impersonation was astonishingly convincing, but that was because he was rather far gone with the drink. OMalley stumbled along at his side, occasionally peering up at the sky and muttering to himself. As the crowd, which was now several hundred strong, neared the mission, it soberly formed into a single file. The 3 men could see that the heavily braced door had been thrown open and that a soft light glowed from within. Pooley fell into line behind the professor, with the muttering OMalley bringing up the rear. As each of the zombie-esque walkers crossed the threshold of the seaman's mission, he or she genuflected and mouthed a short phrase of archaic Latin. Pooley was pleased to note that the phrase spoken by the professor as he entered the portal differed substantially from that of the rest. Jim was no scholar of language, so he merely mumbled incoherently and hoped that none would notice. OMalley was the next to bow his knee, an action which he achieved more through luck than judgment. His knowledge of Latin was extensive, but it was 2 words of the Gaelic that he chose. "Pog Mahone," said the man from the Emerald Isle, raising 2 fingers. There was already a considerable number of people assembled within the mission, and the 3 would-be party-poopers could see little above the multitude of heads. OMalley felt the professor's sinewy hand closing about his arm as the old man drew the Irishman away toward a shadowy corner. Pooley followed them. Here and there he saw a face he recognised, but dull-like, vacant of expression and seeming to lack some essential ingredient of humanity. The 3 men squeezed themselves into a darkened niche at the rear of a large column. The professor pressed a slender finger to his lips.
"Watch and wait,"
he counselled. Pooley bobbed up and down in the hope of observing what was going on. Tiring of this futile occupation, he whispered to OMalley,
"Give us a shin up this pillar and I'll have a look around."
Amid a fair amount of puffing and cursing, all performed in muted tones, Pooley was borne aloft. What he saw sent his brain reeling at the fantastic transformation which had been wrought within the ivy-hung walls of Brentford's Seaman's Mission. The entire building had been gutted, partition walls, doors, the upper floor, all were gone. Pooley found himself staring into what must surely be a cathedral. Rows of elaborately carved Doric columns soared upwards towards the roof, which, once the haunt of nesting wasps and sleeping bats, was now a glistening dome painted and frescoed in the style of Michelangelo, depicting mighty biblical scenes. There was Adam, wide-eyed and innocent, staring into the godly face of his bearded creator. Eve's temptation, with the hideous black serpent entwined about the tree of knowledge. The flood, ferociously portrayed with roaring skies and smashing waters. Noah's Ark pitching and the man of God raising his hands towards heaven. There was the fall of the Tower of Babel, the destruction of Sodom and Gomorrah, and countless other scenes depicted so cunningly that the eye might wander forever amongst them. The great hall was lit by rows of tall wrought-iron torches of ponderous proportions, and their steady light illuminated the astonishing adornments which lined the walls. The gilded icons and embossed tableaux, the bronze statues of the saints, the silver madonnas, and the rows of heraldic crests, each of which bore the emblazoned figure of a great bull. There was a king's ransom here, that of many kings, in fact, in this unlikely setting. And then Pooley's eyes fell upon the altar. He had seen pictures in library books of the altarpieces of the world's most notable cathedrals, but they paled into insignificance before this. It was magnificence beyond magnificence, opulence and grandeur, taken to a point where it surpassed all beauty and became a thing to fear. A profusion of fatly bummed cherubim fluttering and fussing in their golden nakedness, row upon row upon row upon row of candles blazing amid rising gem-covered columns, the traceried woodwork and carved adornments, the proliferation of wondrous beings, half human, half animal, set in attitudes of supplication, gazing ever upwards towards the titanic figure which crested the altarpiece and held in his outstretched arms a hanging tapestry woven in cloth of gold and depicting once again the motif of a great black bull, the banner of the bull, the banner of the Borgias. Pooley could have spent long hours in reverent contemplation of these wonders, had not OMalley chosen this particular moment to topple backwards into the darkness, bringing Jim down from his perch and tumbling him to the floor. "Sorry," said John. "Anything to say?" Pooley shook his befuddled cranium, unable to find words to describe what he had seen. "You have a look," he said finally. "I'll give you a leg up." OMalley's head rose unsteadily above the crowd, which still flowed unabated through the mission door. He saw what Pooley had seen. Certainly the glories were undeniable in their magnificence. But there was something more. OMalley cocked his head up on one side. The geometry of the entire hall was slightly amiss. It was not immediately noticeable, but the more he looked at it, then the more obvious it became. He squinted up at the great pillars supporting the marvellous domed ceiling. Surely they were slightly out of true. Several seemed more closely spaced than the others, and the one at the end was not quite perpendicular. And the dome itself, it was not absolutely round, more ovoid, or more accurately, it was egg-shaped. The great golden altar, for all its unworldly spectacle, was definitely crooked, top-heavy. The statuary was similarly lopsided, some leaning at dangerous angles. The icons seemed to have been nailed into place, and the raised dais which filled an enclosed space before the altar was far from level. Some attempts had obviously been made here to correct the deficiency, and OMalley noted that a number of red fletons had been wedged under one corner of it. Red fletons! OMalley stifled a great guffaw. So that was it! Old Pope Alex was certainly far from omnipotent if he dwelt under the misconception that present-day jobbing builders could repeat the masterworks wrought by their 15th century counterparts. The thought that the Crimson Giant at the mission was actually capable of errors set OMalley in fine spirits. These fine spirits, however, were soon dispelled by what next occurred. The door of the seaman's mission swung shut with a death-cell finality, and a cry rose up from the throats of the assembled multitude. It was not so much a cry as a howl. OMalley hastily returned to floor level and endeavoured to lose himself once and for all amongst the shadows. The howl went up from all corners of the room, animal in nature, atavistic, echoing down centuries, primeval and cruel. The howl rose up, filling the great hall, reverberating about the dome and rebounding from the pillars. It rose and rose in pitch, forming into a scream. The hierophants threw back their heads, hands crossed on their chests like 1,000 dead pharaohs. They swayed upon their heels and howled. Pooley tightened the grip upon his ears. OMalley rolled his eyes, and the professor gripped the silver cross he wore around his neck and mumbled his phrases of Latin. All at once the howl changed, dropped down in tone, and formed itself into a low chant. The professor pricked up his ears. "It is a mantra," he said, although none heard him. Slowly the syllables formed upon one another. The chant went up time after time, driving itself almost physically at the three men crouched in the darkness behind the column. OMalley was staring goggle-eyed, and the professor forced the Irishman's hands up over his ears.
"You must not hear this," he whispered. "You must not hear."
OMalley hummed to himself one of his favourite Republican songs, the much-loved standard Kevin Barry. He was halfway through the now legendary line about the British soldiers torturing the dear lad in order that he might reveal the names of his brave comrades, when he suddenly realised that he was humming alone. OMalley unclasped his ears. There was no sound. The awful chanting had stopped. Nothing moved. The air was still. Or was it? It was a low, incessant hissing sound, soft yet persistent. OMalley raised his eyes once more towards the astonishing ceiling. It was calling from above. He chewed upon his lower lip. This was a sound he recognized, a reassuring, natural sound, not a part of the ghastly, unnatural cacophony. This was something real. And then he knew why the sky had seemed so strange to him that evening. The stars were missing. The moon had gone. While he and Pooley had been sitting in Jack Lane's, the sky had clouded over. John turned to his companion, who still had his hands desperately clamped about his ears. "Listen, Jim," he whispered, prizing Pooley's hands from his head. "It's beginning to rain." Outside the mission and all across Brentford, great drops were starting to fall. They struck the dust of the streets with muted explosions, spattered upon the rooftops and sizzled in the trees. At the Flying Swan, Neville, the part-time barman, set aside his polishing cloth and gazed at the front windows in awe as long teardrops of water began to smear the dusty panes. It was gathering in strength now, and any thoughts Brentford's dehydrated populace may have had of dancing in the streets were rapidly smothered as the thunder began to roll ominously across the heavens and the lightning tore the sky apart. It was as if, at some God-given signal, the very floodgates of heaven had been opened. The rain fell in torrents, a solid sheet of water. The parched ground sucked and gurgled. The allotment lands drew in the life-giving liquid, and the stretch of dried-up canal bed devoured the downfall greedily. It was a storm such as none living could remember. Old Pete ordered himself another large rum and peered out through the Swan's open doorway with much shaking of his ancient head. Norman leant upon the bar counter. "Annus Mirabilis," he said, to the part-time barman. "The year of wonders." At the Seaman's Mission, Pope Alexander the Sixth's congregation paid no heed to the downpour. As the lightning flashed about Brentford, bursting like a million flashbulbs behind gigantic stained-glass windows above the altarpiece, they stood resolute, unmoving. Pooley and OMalley ducked their heads as the thunder crashed deafeningly above. Professor Slocum stared upwards, an unreadable expression on his pale blue eyes. Suddenly the mission seemed to draw backwards, sideways, forwards, simply away, to suck itself into a vacuum beyond the reach of the maelstrom which roared without. It was as if the building had been snatched away into a limbo, a separate dimension insulated totally from all that was real and touchable. The lightning was still visible, flashing behind the stained glass, but now it seemed unable to pierce the panes, stopping short of them as if held at bay by some invisible barrier. The roaring of the storm could still be heard, but it was muffled as if somebody had closed a padded door. A great light began to fill the hall. It grew and grew in brightness until every standing figure, every icon, statue and column became nothing more than a cardboard cutout, lit dazzlingly from one side and lost in a void of absolute blackness to the other. OMalley shielded his eyes and squinted into the glare. Pooley dragged his cloak over his head, dropping his cherished half-brick to the floor. Professor Slocum stood transfixed. From the side of the hall, amid the blinding glare, figures were beginning to appear, moving from the realm of dream or nightmare. The congregation were shuffling backwards, forming themselves into a great arc stretching from the side enclosure to the raised dais of the golden altarpiece. The figures were moving forward in a slow, methodical rhythm. OMalley could make out their silhouettes, sunspots upon the solar disk. There were 4 shapeless, stubby creatures bearing upon their shoulders something enormous upon a kind of chair. Before this procession a lone being moved unsteadily, gaunt and bowed, a golden censer swinging from his clasped hands. OMalley widened his eyes. The figure was that of Captain Carson. He nudged the professor, but the old man put his finger to his lips and whispered, "I know." The captain was dressed in rough sacking robes, a golden sash knotted about his waist. His head was shaven and his feet were bare. His face was as vacant as those of the congregation. Behind him trod the 4 red-clothed and dwarfish figures, the identity of which was well enough known to the 3 watchers. Upon the shoulders of these creatures they supported a gilded travesty of the papal throne, carved from a rich red timber of exotic origin, inset with many precious stones. The arms of this throne terminated in large gilded bull's heads, as did the very crest upon the chair's high back. The eyes of these bovine spectres were great red rubies, glittering flawlessly in the pulsating light which flowed from the being who lounged on the velvet cushioning of the fabulous chair. He was enormous, a titan. His great hands rested upon the bulls' heads, and one could have passed a copper penny through any one of the rings he wore. He was clad in the richest of crimsons, his gown smothered in jewels. These were woven into cunning arabesques, symbols of cuneiforms, diamonds, spirals and trapezoids, each complete of itself yet playing an integral part in the overall design. The gown swam in the throbbing light which surrounded the giant and appeared to pass through several dimensions, shrinking, growing and moving forwards and backwards as if alive. It was belted at the waist by a broad golden cummerbund and heavily quilted at the sleeves. Over his massive shoulders the giant wore the holy mantle, and upon his head the papal mitre, cloth of gold and set again with priceless gems. The 3 men shrank back into the shadows that they might not meet the gaze of the giant as he passed. Never had they seen such a face, surely the very face of death. It was terrible, but it was also magnificent in its perfect control, absolute power and supreme arrogance. The great hawk of a nose, the prominent chin, the high cheekbones, the broad forehead, and the eyes 2 flaming red fires of hell. The throne halted at the dais of the altar. The being who called himself Pope Alexander VI stepped from it onto the platform. The 4 creatures lowered the great throne chair to the floor and prostrated themselves before their master. Captain Carson stood ghost-like, the censer swinging from his gnarled and tattooed fingers suddenly ceased its movement in mid-swing and hung in the air in defiance of all the laws of gravity. Outside, great peals of thunder burst overhead. The lightning flashed and fought with the heavens, and the rain smashed deafeningly upon the mission roof. Within was silence. The flames of the candles upon the torches stood absolutely still and offered little light. The giant slowly folded his Herculean arms and gazed down upon his congregation, who stood immobile, heads bowed, before him. He spoke, and his voice echoed cavernously about the great pillars and filled the dome.
"My people," he said, "my own people, to you is granted the supreme honor, to you, my first chosen. This night you will bear witness to the consecration of the new holy see. You are my disciples, and I, the born again, the Logos, the Master. I grant you this honor. You will spread word of my coming across the world, that all might know my power and marvel at my return."
The words rolled on, a litany of terror. In the shadows of the pillar, Professor Slocum closed his hand about his silver crucifix. OMalley bared his teeth and fingered his half-brick. Pooley wondered whether there might be a back door open somewhere near at hand.
"For centuries mankind has awaited my return, and now I'm here to fulfill the prophecies and to reclaim my throne. You who stand before me are my vessels. Into you shall I pour my powers. You'll be masters of men. None shall stand before you. Through you shall I regain what is rightfully mine."
Professor Slocum held his breath. So this was it. There were easily 400 people in this hall, and if each received only a portion of the giant's powers, they would be virtually unstoppable.
"Kneel before me,"
roared the giant.
Prostrate yourselves before me.
The congregation threw themselves to the floor, pressing their faces down into the cold mosaic. OMalley turned his head away.
Kneel, I say.
OMalley's eyes flashed back to the figure upon the dais. The face was contorted, twisted into a snarl, and the eyes were blazing.
You will kneel.
Across the hall, some 10 or so yards from the three hidden figures, 2 men were standing defiantly amid the sea of fallen bodies. OMalley had little difficulty in recognising one of them. This individual was clad in a dark silk kimono, his head covered by an elaborate Japanese wig. His oversized eyebrows had been dyed the very jettest of blacks and were twisted at their extremities into short spikes. It was Artroy. As OMalley watched, a samurai's companion coolly divested himself of his duffel coat to reveal a clerical collar and the vestments of a priest. It was Father Moiti. OMalley turned to the professor, who shrugged helplessly. Pooley whispered, "This is going to be good. What's the ninja then, John?"
You will kneel before your master.
The giant knotted his fists and drew himself up to even greater heights. Artroy curled his lip, and Father Moiti drew from his raiment a shining crucifix. The congregation were still, their faces pressed to the cold mosaic floor. They would not have dared to rise even if they could. Before the dais, the 4 creatures were shambling to their unearthly feet. The professor drew his 2 cohorts further back into the shadows.
If the opportunity should arise, he whispered, I trust that you will employ those 2 poorly concealed bricks to good advantage.
OMalley winked. Pooley said, "In for a penny?" The rain lashed down on Brentford, and Pope Alexander VI raised his massive arm and pointed towards Artroy and the young priest.
You I will make an example of, he roared. You will know the exquisite agonies of lingering death.
Artroy thumbed his nose. "Bows," said he. The giant gestured to his 4 hooded cardinals.
Bring them to me. Spare only their lives.
The grotesque creatures turned upon the 2 men. Forward they came upon their twisted legs, murmuring and whispering. They had lost their 5th brother to a son of mankind, and yearned only for vengeance upon the entire race. Their beaked mouths opened and closed, dripping vile slime. Close they came, steering their way amongst the prone figures. Slowly they approached the man of the cloth and the student of Count Dante. Artroy watched them come. "My bloody beans," he said, nudging the young priest. Suddenly they were upon him, their claw-like hands reaching out, knobby, crooked appendages displaying wicked barbs. Father Moiti held up his cross and said the words of the rosary. Artroy pivoted upon his heel and swung about, his foot curling through the air in a blurry arc. He struck one of the creatures a devastating blow, sweeping it from its feet and propelling it through the air. It tumbled to the floor several yards away and came to rest beneath one of the great pillars, silent and unmoving. Its unholy brothers slashed at him, but Artroy leapt high into the air above their heads, dropping to the floor behind them. As they turned, the master of Demac let out a mighty yell and drove forward an iron fist. He struck one of the creatures firmly at neck height. There was a sickening report as the thing's head departed its body, a brief swish as it whirled through the air, and a dull thud as it landed amongst the shadows to the rear of the hall. The decapitated body remained upright a moment, the arms flailing about and clawing at the space his head had occupied. Then it toppled backwards, a crumpled heap of red cloth. The giant upon the dais raised his hands towards the great dome. "Destroy him!" he screamed. "Destroy him!" Artroy stood undaunted, perfect testimony to the confidence-boosting powers of Count Dante's art. As the 2 demented godless beings fell upon him, he drew back both his arms and flung them forward in perfect unison. His fists passed clear through the chests of the creatures, emerging from their spines amid a tangle of root-like fibres and a great tearing of cloth. Artroy shook the now limp forms away from him and turned upon Alexander VI. "You're next, pal," he said. OMalley stared in awe. This was the Artroy he had struck down upon the allotment. Pooley said, "That particular blow seems uniformly effective." Artroy stood thumbing his nose and flexing his muscles. Clearly it was impossible for him to feel any fear, no matter how appalling his adversary. Father Moiti knelt at his side, hands clasped in prayer. OMalley's heart went out to the young priest who, possessing none of Artroy's ripping, tearing, maiming and mutilating techniques, had come armed only with his faith to face the diabolical power of the Crimson Giant. Upon the dais Pope Alexander VI stood, his entire body trembling, throbbing with unimaginable anger. Behind him, through the stained-glass window, the lightning flashed, casting his massive shadow across the great hall. The light about him grew and became a blazing white inferno, forming itself into a blinding corona. His contours blurred, and naught could be seen of him but for the two red blood bowls of his eyes. A strange vibration ran through the air of the mission. OMalley felt the skin of his face being forced back as if by the pressure of increased G-forces. His cheeks seemed to stretch and draw themselves towards his ears. Tears flew from his eyes, and he found it impossible to close them. Pooley clung desperately to the great pillar, and the frail professor staggered back against the side wall. It was as if a hurricane of icy wind had been directed at them. The congregation were beginning to rise, shaking their heads like awakened sleepwalkers, and shielding their faces from the glare. Archroy stood firmly anchored to the floor, his kimono flapping about him. His exotic wig was torn from his head, exposing his alopecia to full effect. Father Moiti raised his hand in benediction and uttered the first words of the holy exorcism, but the force struck him, buffeting him backwards and silencing his voice. Folk were tumbling over one another like rag dolls, bowling over the floor and fluttering against the walls. The door of the mission burst outwards and crashed into the rain-lashed night, cartwheeling over and over towards the Butts estate. The figure upon the dais came and went amid the corona of light, his arms outstretched and his head thrown back. And then, amid the icy, unstoppable blast, a low rumble penetrated the mission, issuing up from the very bowels of the earth. Its reverberations rolled across the floor, quivering the mighty torches and spilling out the candles. OMalley felt the vibrations growing beneath his feet, and knew where he felt them before. That night in Sprite Street, when Soap Distant had performed his ill-fated act of inner portal opening. The deluge had raised the level of the Thames, spilling the waters over the lock gates and down into the dried-up canal. The water was flooding from there into Soap's subterranean labyrinth, which must surely run directly beneath the mission. The great, ill-constructed columns trembled, and the figure upon the dais looked up, an expression of horror covering his hideous face. For a moment his power faltered, and that moment was all which was required. The congregation, freed of the binding force, began a mad exodus, cramming through the doorway and out across the Butts estate. Sections of the frescoed ceiling began to fall away. A great crack appeared in the floor near the doorway and shot across the marble mosaic to the foot of the dais. Pope Alexander stepped back and prepared to marshal his power against the ruination of his Vatican. Father Moiti climbed uncertainly to his feet. The floor was shifting beneath him, and portions of it were breaking away and tumbling into the foaming waters which roared beneath. Archroy clutched his clerical companion, and the two stood staring towards the figure on the dais. Pooley and OMalley were endeavouring to raise the fallen professor, who looked near death.
"Don't worry about me," the old man gasped. "His defences are down. Strike now before it is too late."
Pooley scrambled off in search of his half-brick, which had been torn away along with his cloak. OMalley, who had clutched his throughout as the drowning man clutches at the proverbial straw, bore it into the light. Sadly, OMalley was no accurate hurler of half-bricks. Had he been so, but it is possible that his aim would have been greatly improved. As it was, his ill-flung projectile looped through the air, missing a crimson figure by several feet and striking one of the torches, cleaving out a row of the candles. This fell upon one of the woven tapestries, setting it ablaze. The crimson figure whirled as the flames licked up behind him. Archroy was advancing across the hall, his bald head flashing like a neon sign in the lightning flares. The rain lashed in through the doorway, and the waters beneath roared deafeningly. The last of the congregation had long since departed. Pope Alexander VI was alone with his tormentors. They would all die for their blasphemy, each in turn. The old man scrambling across the crumbling floor, the young priest kneeling, those two skulking in the shadows, and the maniac in the kimono. He would be the first. Archroy leapt onto the dais and confronted the glowing giant. "Come and get your medicine," he sneered. "Come and get your—" The words froze in his throat as the giant raised his hand. Archroy became welded to the spot. His face took on an expression of dire perplexity as he strained against the force which surrounded him. Professor Slocum had reached Father Moiti and held out his old black book to the priest.
Read with me, he said.
Pope Alexander turned in satisfaction from the oriental statue upon the dais. He raised his hands aloft, and the light reached out from his fingertips and blazed across the hall, striking the two men. But nothing happened. The professor and the young priest continued to mouth the ancient formula, and although their words were lost in the storm, the effect was manifest. Their mouths moved in unison, intoning the spells syllable upon syllable. Pope Alexander folded his brow and increased his power, the light radiating from his hands flooding the hall. His eyes burned and his body shuddered and trembled. Pooley's fingers tightened about his half-brick. The giant stiffened, concentrating every last ounce of its energy upon the two men. The corners of the old black book began to smoulder. Sweat ran down the face of Father Moiti. The professor's fingernails scorched and crackled. Jim Pooley threw his half-brick. The missile struck the giant firmly between his flaming eyes. He had channeled his entire energy into attack and kept little in reserve for his own defence. He stumbled back, his arms flailing, the beams of light crisscrossing the mission like twin searchlights, and now another figure was moving across the dais. It was Captain Carson, and he clutched two blazing candles. The giant saw him approaching, but it was too late. Captain Carson thrust the candles at the crimson robes, which caught in a gush of fire, enveloping the struggling figure. As he tottered to and fro, striking at himself, his power relaxed, and Archroy, free of the paralysing trance, leapt forward. His foot struck the giant squarely in the chest, buffeting back into the blazing tapestry which collapsed upon him.
"By fire!"
shouted Professor Slocum, looking up from his book. Pope Alexander staggered about the dais, an inhuman torch. Above the flames, the unnatural light still glowed brightly about him, pulsating and changing colour through the spectrum. Captain Carson was clapping his hands and jumping up and down on his old legs in a delirium of pleasure. The professor and the priest continued to read. Pooley emerged from the shadows, and OMalley patted him upon the shoulder. "Nice one," he said. Archroy's vindictiveness, however, knew no bounds. He was being given, at long last, a chance to get it all out of his system. His car, his beans, the birdcage, his mad wife, and this staggering inferno before him who embodied everything he loathed and detested, and who was indeed the cause of all the indignities he had suffered during the last year. With a cry of something which sounded like number 32 on the menu of Chan's Chinese chippy, Archroy leapt at the blazing giant. He struck him another devastating blow. The giant staggered back to the edge of the dais, wildly flapping his arms beneath the blazing tapestry in a vain attempt to remain upright, then fell with a hideous scream down through the gaping crack in the mission's floor to the torrents beneath.
"By water!"
Archroy slapped his hands together. "Gotcha!" he chortled. The professor and the young priest crossed the floor towards the chasm and stood at the brink.
"He will not die," yelled the old man above the maelstrom. "We have not yet finished the exorcism."
Pooley joined the professor and peered down into the depths. "He's going down the main drain," he said. "We can follow him." The flames had by now reached the tracery work of the great altar and were taking hold. Smoke billowed through the mission, and several of the great columns looked dangerously near collapse.
"Out, then!" shouted the professor. "Lead the way, Jim."
Pooley looked up towards Captain Carson, who was still dancing a kind of hornpipe upon the dais, the altar flaring about him. "You left to bring him," cried Jim. "We can't leave him here." The professor dispatched OMalley to tackle the task, while he, Jim Pooley, Father Moiti, and Archroy tore out into the rain-lashed night. Pooley aided the professor, although the old man seemed to have summoned up considerable stores of inner strength. It was almost impossible to see a thing through the driving rain, but as the four ran across the estate, Pooley suddenly called out, "There, that grill at the roadside!" Up through the grating a fierce light burned. As they reached it, the old professor and the young priest shouted down the words of the exorcism. The lightning lit the pages of the old black book to good effect, and as the glow beneath the grating faded and passed on, the four men rushed after it. Up near Sprite Street, OMalley caught them up. "I got him outside," he panted, "but he wouldn't leave. Said he wanted to see every last inch of the place burned to the ground." "There! There!" shouted Pooley as a glow appeared briefly from a drain covering up ahead. Professor Slocum handed his book to Father Moiti.
"You must finish it," he gasped. "My breath is gone."
They passed up Sprite Street and turned into Mafeking Avenue. OMalley aiding the wheezing ancient as best he could, while Pooley, Artroy and the young priest pounded on ahead, stopping at various drains and reciting the exorcism. As they neared Albany Road, several great red fire engines screamed around the corner on their way to the blazing mission. At the Ealing Road, Artroy, Pooley and Father Moiety stopped. OMalley and the Professor caught up with them, and the five stood in the downpour.
"We've lost him," panted Jim. "The drain's all split up along here. It could have gone down in any direction. Down most, probably."
"Did you finish the exorcism?"
the Professor asked, coughing hideously. The young priest nodded. "Just before we lost him."
"Then let us pray that we have been successful."
OMalley looked about him. Before them gleamed the lights of the 4 horsemen, for the 5 bedraggled saviours of society were now standing outside Jack Lane's.
"Well then,"
said OMalley,
"if that's that, then I think we still have time for a round or two."
Professor Slocum smiled broadly.
"It will be a pleasure for me to enjoy a drink at your expense, John," he said.
"A small sherry," said Father Moiety, "or perhaps upon this occasion a large one."
As they entered the establishment, Pooley felt Artroy's hand upon his shoulders.
"Just a minute, Jim," said he. "I would have words with you."
Jim turned to the waterlogged samurai. The rain had washed the dye from his eyebrows, and they hung dog-like over his eyes.
"That pair of cricketer's whites you're wearing," Artroy continued, "and the unique pattern upon the fair royal jumper. Surely I've seen these before."
Jim backed away through the rain.
Now, Artroy," he said, "you're making a mistake. I can explain everything." With these words, Jim Pooley took to his heels and fled.